maintained so long as we fulfill our obligation to pay and to retire the fulfilled principal from circulation at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property. As we have said, the lie of terminal pretended economy in fact denies the actual creditor interest, while actual economy dissolves any actual risk to every real creditor. What intelligent, truly self-determined people, then, could knowingly be scammed by the unwarranted intervention of an extrinsic party claiming without a single factual supporting principle that we cannot issue our promissory obligations to each other on our paper, and that for issuing our promissory obligations to each other on their paper, not only should all of us owe them 4 houses for every house we ever occupy, which we alone produce, we should be forced to reborrow all the interest and principal we pay out of circulation in the process of servicing falsified obligations which ever more vastly exceed the entire circulation, until ultimately we are completely dispossessed when we have inevitably accumulated a terminal sum of falsified debt. In apprehending the natural commitments of the promissory obligations which comprise their currency, then, the unwitting victim class would first discover that their own indifference to principle has first allowed a mere pretended creditor, generally a purported central banking system, to launder all the principle of eternity into its unjustifiable possession, as if our promissory obligations to each other were debts to a mere publisher of the evidence of our obligations to each other. Know then, we do not simply borrow money from a bank. On the contrary, we only think, ever so wrongly, that we can only acquire our own promissory obligations to each other from a bank, which in fact only obfuscates our promissory obligations to each other into falsified debts to itself, for purposes which obviously were never designed to serve universal rights and interests. Thus, for every house the unwitting victim class might build, and without a single possible justifying principle, the unwitting victim class will falsely owe and give up at least a house in just principle to an ever unassented impostor who merely publishes the evidence of their promissory obligations to each other. And just economy will be impossible for this first error alone, because it will be mathematically impossible to solve inflation, deflation, or systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property as a circulation of the evidence of our promissory obligations to each other would rightly be coupled to each and every deserving subject. A further reason that even the least suggestion of a very different actual economy can never whisper truth to the unwitting victim class, then, is that even as this unwarranted publisher risks no more than the negligible costs of publication, thus if a further, even more damaging crime is to persist, of subjecting these falsified artificial debts to an invalid claim to interest, it is necessary that the unwitting victim class accept a stupefying deception that they can only borrow or rent their own contracts to pay each other from a bank. The further lie that risked and deserved possession justifies interest, therefore, is even far more preposterous dupery. For without the least veritable proof from its pathological perpetrators, or the least of their own proper diligence, The unwitting victim class simply swallows a hideous distortion of purported risk when the only possession was the mere costs of publication. And while the negligible costs of publication are routinely reacquired by the false creditor in just a tiny fraction of the very first payment against each falsified debt. It might, for instance, cost no more than $10 to issue $100,000 of evidence of our obligations to each other into circulation, and this $10 would typically be reacquired with no further risk whatsoever in just 1% of the first payment against the falsified debt, against a falsified debt which does not even exist to the falsified creditor, and with this first payment, therefore, already profiting the pretended creditor over the actual cost or risk and over its negligible possession no less than 100 times over. To even presume purported interest is justified in the case of a $100,000 home, for example, is as much as to blindly accept without a single veritable principle, and obviously without ever doing the elementary math correctly, that certain people, distinguished only by the remarkably inconsistent fact they neither produce anything nor contribute anything we cannot provide ourselves at virtually no cost and entirely without damaging consequence, somehow have some ever disproven ability to rightly wield some ever unjustified and ever more destructive authority over the rest of us, for no more than $10, to collect 4 homes for every home all of us ever so much as produce, that we may occupy our own houses. Thus, in their ignorance of preposterous obfuscation serving nothing but their own ever-escalated dispossession, the unwitting victim class is perpetually dispossessed to an ever further and inevitably terminal extent, as they are forced to maintain a vital circulation by perpetually reborrowing the principal and interest they pay out of the general circulation in servicing the falsified debts, which, by ever greater sums of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of artificial debt, perpetually increases the sum of falsified debt until they suffer complete dispossession at an inevitable failure of what is no more than a terminal system of exploitation. Whatever principle is necessarily reborrowed to maintain a vital circulation, to that extent makes it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of falsified debt, as new artificial debt perpetually sustains the previous sum of falsified debt. On the other hand, whatever interest is necessarily reborrowed to maintain a vital circulation perpetually increases the sum of falsified debt by so much as ever greater sums of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of falsified debt, until the priority of servicing a terminal sum of falsified debt makes it impossible to sustain either the circulation or the industry which remains obliged to do so. Further creditworthiness is inherently destroyed. It is impossible even to maintain a vital circulation if we abide by the corrupt systemic means to do so, the fact of which unfolds in the present dependence on artificial sustention or purported rescue, inevitably at the cost of further falsified debt above an already terminal sum of falsified debt. With these self-defeating means of purported rescue only becoming indispensable at the onset of complete systemic failure. And so the system of irreversibly escalated exploitation reaches its maximum practical lifespan, whereafter, against the very falsified rules it claims for itself, because this abomination can only suck a surviving host into yet another desolation. The unwitting victim class is eventually, once again, simply allowed, despite its inherently destroyed creditworthiness, to begin anew, under an ancient ruse which can only repeat the fatal pattern of their complete disposition, because the ruse can only multiply artificial indebtedness in proportion to remaining capacity to pay. All the regulation in the world which preserves the contemporary lies of pretended economy, therefore, can only temper this inevitably terminal process, because the falsified claim to interest is the whole purpose and fabric of the purported banking system. Thus, the only possible goal of pretending the lie can be rescued from itself is to preserve the crime. And indeed, therefore, no mystery whatever exists why all the subversion which is indispensable to this stupendous crime avoids every opportunity to prove it serves us. The lie that fatal multiplication of artificial costliness is economy can never be proven or justified even to the most unwitting victims, however wrongly they might believe otherwise, because neither its wanting justice or economy can actually be proven to anyone. And so, as much as the ruse could only have caused a first Great Depression, indeed it can only repeat the fatal pattern because it is the fundamental cause of inevitable failure. Thus, however, its perpetrators pretend they might rescue this perpetual multiplication of artificial indebtedness from itself, the ruse persists in terminal failure after terminal failure until the unwitting class, victim class, finally rises above the pathological lie that usury is economy, rather than perpetually crying out in terminal stupidity, who would ever loan us our own promissory obligations to each other, if our very own promissory obligations to each other were not subject to interest upon a falsified debt to someone entirely else? In the predetermined contest before us, then, a little but sufficiently wiser people inevitably prevail for no more than resurrecting the few different actual principles which can sustain their common interests. They rise from the unwitting victim class, then, only by finding the absolute answers to simple, conclusive questions. Is there more than one solution to inflation and deflation? Absolutely not. For only an obligatory rate of payment of the principal as the property is consumed retires so much circulation as maintains a circulation which is forever equal to remaining value. Is there more than one integral solution to inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by falsified and entirely redundant claims to interest? Absolutely not. Likewise, systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property is only solved by the integral combination of these mere two elementary solutions, which eradicate the only powers to corrupt volume, disposition, and or relative value of a circulation by no more than dispelling the falsified claim to interest, which is the fundamental cause of inevitable failure, and retiring principle according to the obligatory